The predicaments and paradoxes of love, honour and duty are central in Mosley's first novel, Spaces of the Dark, which is about a returning soldier who, in battle, has had to shoot his best friend. Crippled with guilt and helpless in the grip of his passions, he then falls in love with two women and eventually gets himself killed, again for the sake of love and honour.
If it wants to get on the curve,
In reality, Mosley seemed to be having a happy life. After the war, he began studying philosophy at Oxford, where he met Rosemary Salmond. Neither of them wanted a conventional upper-class life, so after their marriage they tried to run a small hill farm in Wales. Nicholas began to write, Rosemary went to art school, and they started a family.
I think my first hero in Spaces of the Dark, I think he saw his family as being stuck as sort of characters, and he didn't want to be this himself. He wanted to recognize that he was not this. His family weren't really stuck in character. They'd chosen to become characters, sort of husks, and he didn't want this because he didn't think it was true.
This was autobiographical, of course, wasn't it?
Well, Spaces of the Dark is a complicated book in a sense. It was autobiographical, but when I was writing it, I was a young man who could come home from the Second World War and was having a very good time. And my hero was a man who came back from the Second World War and was having a perfectly horrible time. I could see that he was not a sort of character stuck in the script, but he still had a pretty miserable script to act out, because I thought that was the way to write stories. This was the traditional way to write stories. I mean, traditionally, young men who come home from the war have a horrible time because that makes a story. It makes a good story. A young man who comes home from the war, okay, he's had a horrible war. It's terrible things and sad things he's seen and have happened to him, but he's okay. This is something that makes a complex story, and I didn't have the courage or the ability or the knowingness to write it at that time.
In 1948, Oswald returned to politics, but his style was unchanged. He claimed that the issue was unemployment, but he focused on racism. When Nicholas confronted him over his manipulation of racial feeling, his father said that he would never speak to him again. A few years later things were patched up, but Mosley said it was as though his father's refusal to recognize his own pattern trapped him on a treadmill. By the early 1950s, Nicholas and Rosemary had given up on their idea of a haven in Wales and were again living near the temptations of London life. They enjoyed their social position, but they also feared complacency and what Evelyn Waugh had called the blight of English charm. With some thought of becoming a director, Mosley made several 16mm films with his friends and family as the actors. The Policeman's mother is like a mixture of Chaplin and Brunel, interweaving sentimentality and perversity, tragedy and farce. At the centre there is a clever trickster. For Mosley, the effort to be a committed father and husband and writer, finding out about life, seemed to require what he has described as a kind of juggling act on a one-wheeled bicycle, where everything was kept vital and lively, and inevitably others as well as himself were hurt. But he was determined not to deny parts of himself, which he thought of as a kind of death, and not to be trapped in a scripted life. In his early 30s, after 3 serious novels which had been very well received, Mosley was sufficiently dissatisfied with their wordy, what he called rhapsodic style, and with himself, that he gave up writing.
I couldn't see any point in going on writing these crazy stories about loony characters all burbling on, well, because the human beings that I knew or loved or interested in weren't like this. Even from my first novel, I think there was this sort of idea that characters were not really human. They were a terrible travesty of what a human being might be. They were sort of jokes. They were things people could condescend to. And everyone loves these terrible sort of Dickens characters, but they're awful people. They aren't human beings hardly. Everyone thinks, wow, this is wonderful character building, but so what? I suppose I wanted to see people who would change. Every time they felt themselves in danger of becoming a character, they wanted to break it up and move out. What does it mean, breaking up, moving out? It means you, all this thing we've been saying, you risk yourself, expose yourself. Character is a sort of husk that forms round a human being when he packs up with the ability to see what he really is.
In an attempt to drive out his devils, and partly through the influence of an Anglican monk, Father Raymond Raines, Mosley became for a time a practicing Christian. He edited the journal Prism, and after Raines' death he was invited to write his biography. But Mosley's explorations led to unorthodox conclusions. He took the New Testament to mean that humans must now be independent of Scripture, and in the parables he saw indications of a style of mind which could move beyond the level of moral judgments and paradoxes. In Experience and Religion, he tried to talk about marriage, family, and faith, not in terms of dogma, but in terms of what humans know about themselves, and the ways in which relationships actually work.
Then I started to feel, okay, I understand this, I see, this is okay. So then I wanted to write novels again. I suddenly saw a whole new way of writing novels about people who were not stuck, people who didn't duck the complexities and contradictions and paradoxes of life, but say, okay, I've got something within me that can deal with this. They weren't a different type of human beings. They just carried around in them the knowingness of what it was to be a human being.
I'd like to write a novel.
You would, eh?
But I can't.
It's child's play. All you need is a starting point.
And?
Here, for instance.
Where?
Here, on this lawn. What are we all up to?
Rosalind's lying down. Stephen's weeding the garden. Anna's making a daisy chain. We're having this conversation.
Good. But then you could go further. Rosalind is pregnant. Stephen is having an affair with a girl at Oxford. He's reached the age where he can't keep his hands off girls at Oxford.
What?
But he feels guilty, of course. So he makes up a story.
What story?
This story.
What are you talking about?
In the text of the novel, the writer replies that we know too much about characters and actions and society, that we can now go on to write about people knowing. The challenge was to write effectively from a perspective outside the familiar patterns of life and of fiction. Part of the solution was in a style which would catch the dynamics of thinking.
This is what I like about this, the way that it looks absolute chaos, and then suddenly stones, if you just go tugging along, stones suddenly fit.